Leighton, thank you so much for joining me on The Same Drugs. I'm looking forward to talking to you again. We talked very recently in person, which is nice. That's usually the kind of the opposite of how things go with me. I usually interview people and then eventually sometimes maybe meet them in person, but here we are.
We met
How
and
are
we
you?
hung out in the Tenderloin.
Yeah.
Good.
You guys sufficiently scared me walking
Yeah.
around the open air drug markets.
Yeah, that was fun. Welcome to our life. We spend inordinate amounts of time in that neighborhood. It's every time I come home, I'm like, Michael leaves his shoes outside his house for like 3 days whenever he goes to the Tenderloin, which I started doing
Oh,
after he told me about that. It's just so, oof.
yeah, that's probably a good
But
plan.
yeah, but yeah,
Yeah.
I'm good.
Um, I'm interested in, we talked a little bit last week in the ghetto. I shouldn't say that, I guess, because it's not actually a ghetto. It's just a really bad situation that's expanded
Yeah.
far and wide throughout San Francisco,
Yeah.
which we can talk a little bit about later. But we talked a little bit about your history and how you got to be where you are today, which I found quite interesting. So I would like to learn a bit more about that. I think you mentioned you came out of the labor movement.
Yes, I graduated from college, and well, there was a couple of years hiatus in New York when I wasn't doing much of anything. But then I came back to the Bay and signed. Actually, the story starts when I went to the WTO protest in Seattle, and in '99, and I got arrested there, and I spent like for a political protest, and I spent a few days in jail. And then when I was there with a bunch of union organizers who just were friends. They just happened to be friends of mine. A friend of mine from high school got into organizing, and then I went with him and his friends. And I was like, so that was a radicalizing moment for me, like participating in totally peaceful, constitutionally protected protest and getting arrested and thrown in jail. And I was around all these activists who were doing these crazy civil disobediences, all the way through like police processing. It was like I won't go into detail about it, but it was crazy. It was wild, and so I think I after that I decided, okay, I want to devote my. This is when I was a lefty, which we can talk about that too, because I think my politics as yours have evolved. But then I was just 100% lefty, and so I wanted to devote my life for at least the foreseeable future to something subversive. And so I worked for a healthcare workers union for a while, organizing in the Bay Area. Then I went to grad school. Then I decided I was going to be a professor. And then this is like, I almost feel like it's like a cliche when I describe this trajectory, because it's like so many young lefties. I went to grad school, was going to get a PhD, and like, I guess use my, be intellectually subversive or something. And then I decided that wasn't for me. So I went back to the union, and that time I moved down to LA, and I worked for the same union there. Then we had this is SEIU. We had a big sort of dust up with the international union. My local did. We got into a big fight with them over all types of issues around worker democracy, and we thought they were selling out our members. So we got in this. I'm cutting some of my career trajectory out because it's boring, but we ended up going into a war with the international union. So our local and the international union just it was like a protracted battle of trying to decertify each other's facilities up and down the state. And I did that. So that union is called NUHW. I did that for I think a couple of years, and then after that, I started going into what I do now, which is journalism and documentary filmmaking.
Mm-hmm. Are you still a union supporter, or did that change?
In principle, I definitely am, insofar as I believe that workers have a right to collectively bargain. 100%. I think it's a necessary and it's a healthy and necessary part of capitalism. I don't know that I would be aligned with a lot of the unions in the United States with most of their broader social agenda now. I would around some of the economic stuff, like universal health care. I haven't changed my position on that. I think that the United States is lacking in that. And that's obviously a huge issue within labor, maybe one of the biggest issues within labor. Just, I think that a lot of unions have become very woke, and just like everybody, just like all the institutions on the left, and have and would align them. I mean, I know that the union I used to work for is like endorses these candidates who I want to throw out of office, like locally here. So no, I would not be aligned with probably most of their political program, but then nor was I when I even worked there. But then it was because I was like, they're not radical enough. These candidates aren't radical enough. Now it's more like I'm like, these candidates are crazy woke people, and they're bad news. But in terms of the principles of the labor movement, I'm still absolutely supportive.
Yeah,
What
that's
about you?
interesting.
You come from a labor background, from a union household.
Yeah, I feel similarly to you. I mean, I came from a union family. My dad was a postie for many years when I was a kid, and he was very involved in the union. And when we were little, me and my sister, we would go to strikes with him, and we'd go to union meetings and play with the staplers. And I mean, that's what I understood the left to be primarily, to be about class and about supporting the labor movement and workers' rights. I mean, I became super leftist like you, where I thought that the left was not left enough. Like I felt I was much more radical. And since my politics have evolved, I still support the labor movement. But like you, I mean, the unions in Canada support almost everything that I don't support. And those guys, those unions who are, completely enmeshed with the NDP, which is our leftist, it would have been, sort of like the Labour Party. They were socialist at one point, probably back in the 70s and 80s, and then moved closer to the center. But those people, I mean, they tried to destroy me, and sort of, they are opposed to everything that I advocate for almost. They advocated heavily for and still do the legalization of prostitution. They're completely invested in trans rights. And they tried to defund the one women's shelter in Canada, Vancouver Rape Relief, who stood firm on their woman only policy. So it's
what
tough.
happened in the United States, I mean, this is like, a lot of this was before I was working for the union, but I was also kind of part of it. The SEIU is the big progressive union in the United States, or one of them, and it's the one that's the most powerful. It's I think the second biggest union in the US, and they were one of the unions that kind of pioneered this method of like, I actually shouldn't say they pioneered it, because this goes back to the UFW, like the Cesar Chavez's farm workers in the 60s, where they were like recruiting all these like kids from Harvard, right, to come, like these college kids to come out and organize and bring their cultural capital to like devise new strategies and stuff. But SEIU really kind of brought that to almost industrial scale, where they just like started hiring a ton of. It started off as a janitors union, and then it went into, but now their biggest sector is healthcare, and they brought in all these like kids who went to fancy colleges, and I was one of those. I went to a fancy college on the East Coast, and it was, and like, say what you will about the authenticity of the working class, but like when you bring people in who have that kind of background, they do bring something to the table, right? It's like there's a reason why they're hired. They bring something to the table in terms of that lends itself to an ability to win campaigns. So SEIU started for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons was that they brought in all these kind of hotshot college educated kids. They just started, coming up with really innovative tactics and just winning a lot of campaigns and growing at a rapid clip. So that was it's a sensible thing for a union to do. You want to win, but there's a cost to it on the other side. Like I remember I was in an organizing campaign where we were fighting the steel workers. Both the steel workers and us were trying to organize the same hospital. It's pretty stupid that the steel workers are organizing hospitals, but then again, we were originally a janitors union, so what can I say? But the steelworkers had a rule where you could not be a rank and file officer, like in the executive. I don't think you couldn't be. Let me say this again: you couldn't be a staff organizer unless you came out of the rank and file. So all their staff organizers were workers who became shop stewards, and that was a lot of SEIU organizers were that too, but they didn't allow this thing of like bringing in people who from outside of the union, like from right. Kids who went to fancy colleges. They didn't allow that, and I respect that, but it wasn't effective for them. They were losing, it wasn't a winning strategy for them. But I don't know much about the steel workers now, but my guess is that they're not near there was a cost that SEIU paid on the other end, which was like, it's fucking woke. It's like, it's reflective of the PMC now. It's very much, I think its politics are not a reflection of its rank and file members. It's a reflection right. of the college educated elite cadre intelligentsia that is really running shit at that union. And that describes a lot of unions.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's similar to the situation in Canada where it's not the working class who are running the unions. Right. It's the middle and even the middle upper class. Right. So I don't know how those people could possibly, I'm sorry to play identity politics, but I don't really think that people who grew up with money and that kind of privilege understand what it's like to be working class. Right, I don't think they even know any working class people, to be honest. I think that they don't really relate to working class people, and you can that's reflected in today's progressive / woke politics.
Yeah, that's probably true. And also, I don't want to be mistaken for like trying to cosplay as some kind of like salt of the earth person. I came from like an upper middle class background growing up, so I came into and then I became Should I just log off?
Yeah, shut the laptop.
So, but I will say that for myself, I to my credit, when I went into these facilities, I never like pretended or believed myself to be like some sort of like simpatico with like the work, like I understood right. that people working there. I was like, I'm on a fucking learning curve here, like I gotta go in here and basically earn people's respect, even though I'm not from the same background that they were. And the way I did it, I remember consciously making this decision. I kind of almost remember the minute that I made this decision. I was like, I'm not going to change anything about how I talk, how I act. Like, I'm not going to dumb down my college vocabulary. I'm not going to do any of that because I'm not going to condescend to people. Yeah. And I'm not going to like LARP, So I'm just going to talk to people in the way that I would talk to anybody in any peer. And even if that's not quote unquote relatable, I think it'll command some respect in just the way that normal human beings respect other people who they see as not being fake. Mm-hmm. And I think that worked. Like I wasn't trying to pretend to be something I wasn't, or somebody who like understood the plight of like people who are struggling, or any of that shit. So that's what I did. But I agree with you that you can't, you can understand things intellectually. I mean, I think that it's possible for people to grow and understand, like, learn from other people and gain a sympathetic understanding of other people's struggles and their plights. But it's not a great situation when you have a bunch of people who went to Yale running the American labor movement.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like on principle, I always understood the labor movement and that class struggle of the left of yesteryear to be about the working class organizing right. in defense of themselves. So I guess that's part of why I say that. I'm curious to know what you studied in university and what you were planning to do your PhD in.
I studied history as an undergrad, but I did my PhD, or I was in a PhD program for sociology.
And what was your experience? Like, what year was that around?
I went into that program in 2001. It was either 2000 or 2001.
Yeah.
Yeah, long time ago. And what was
Like,
your
did you
question? What was
find that
my
to be
experience
like,
of the program?
I mean, yeah, well, I'm just curious to know if you found it to be a valuable experience. I mean, we nowadays mock academia, especially the humanities, for I think good reason. I mean, I enjoyed university, to be honest. I was in women's studies, which is
Mm-hmm.
heavily mocked, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
fair in some ways. Although I started
Gender
out in women's
studies,
studies.
gender
Well, I started
studies.
out in women's
That's
studies before
transphobic.
women's studies
That's
became
transphobic.
exactly. When I was in my women's studies program, they changed it
Right.
over to gender studies. They
Mm-hmm.
started erasing women from the women's studies program to focus more heavily on men who like to dress like women. But but for most of like the first, like half at least of my education, it was still women's studies.
Yeah.
But I mean, in retrospect, I suppose I see academia as a little bit silly in a lot of ways. Like, it's not like I developed any really useful skills in that program. It was useful to me because of what I ended up doing with my career, but I can't imagine that it would be very useful in any other context.
Yeah, it's definitely not useful. I loved it. I was at Cal at UC Berkeley, and I loved it because it was like this. It was the college experience I feel like I never had. It was like actually really intellectually engaging and like really this just really rich, vibrant environment of intellectual discourse. It was just, I carry it with me now. Everything that I learned there, it was an exhilarating experience, even though I ended up deciding not to go into academia as a career. That said, today I know, because I've heard this from people in the department, that it is not what it was when I was there back then. I assumed, because of my experience as a grad student, I know how like the people in my cohort were like whip smart. Some of the smartest people I've ever met. Very, very deeply intellectual. And so like I assumed naively that the whole kind of like woke cultish mind virus thing that took over like undergrads on campus, that probably didn't infiltrate the graduate level, or at least not in the department I was in.
Mm-hmm.
And then I talked to some professors who were there, and they're like, no, it's if anything worse than the undergrads. There was a point at which they were like, the grad students had come together into some committee with some faculty there, and they demanded, and I think they achieved, the authority to go through all of the professors' curriculums, not like the stuff that they were teaching, not just grad students but undergrads as well, to make sure that it was consistent with the discipline's historical adherence to anti-racism. And so like what that means, like it's like, it sounds noble, but they wanted to teach like an even racial split of like the writers that they were teaching. So like, kick out some of the white males and bring in like W.D. Du Bois, who, by the way, I've read Du Bois. He's a great writer. He is not fucking Emile Durkheim, or it's just not the same, it's not the same level of sophisticated, or just like the theoretical importance. But then it was also like, I didn't get into the details, but my guess is that it was like, are you teaching Ibram Kendi? Are you teaching all this like to undergrads? And so it was like, but they were like, the crazy thing is that these are like grad students who are demanding a committee to be able to like review the curricula that the professors are instructing for like political conformity and political like loyalty to an ideological dogma, which is like the most anti-intellectual shit I can imagine. So at this point, I'm just so relieved that I dropped out of academia, because if that happened at that department I was in, then it's every other department is done for.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't know what I would have done. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
think I would have made it through because I also was on route towards doing a PhD and decided against it. And I decided I wanted to go into journalism and, write for the people.
What was the
but
remind me what the PhD was in? What the
women's
doctoral?
studies. Well, it would have been
Oh, that was okay.
gender, sexuality, and women's studies. But I did my BA in women's studies. I did a master's degree that when I was going in was called women's studies, and while I was in that department, the name changed to gender, sexuality, and women's studies.
Mm-hmm.
And then while I was finishing that master's degree, I started a master's degree in journalism, which I dropped out of before I finished because I started doing actual journalism and I couldn't afford to, and I didn't have time to go to school like full time. There was no part-time options. It was full time. And I was like an adult, like most people in the program were younger than me. So I had, parental support or were living at home or whatever. And I was like, I was like 30 years old or so. I was living at home and I was like, hey, I got to go to work now. Like I had to like leave class halfway through.
But a degree in journalism to me sounds like it's like a degree in like hiking, like climbing mountains or something.
It's stupid because the only way you learn how to do journalism is by doing journalism.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I did that program partly because I was encouraged to by my supervisor in women's studies who was connected to a woman in that department who really wanted me to come into the department because I was kind of already doing some stuff like in radio and things like that. And they thought it would be good to have like a feminist there. I suppose. I think they liked my work at the time. I'm sure they don't like it anymore. But I just couldn't figure out how to get published. Like it seemed like a big mystery to me. And the way that it was really set up in a way where it's hard to break in if you aren't in a journalism school because you can't get an internship. And if you can't get an internship, it's hard to get connected to the editors and the publications that you needed to connect to. In Canada, we have a very small media landscape, so it really is hard to break in. So it actually did help me break in, but then once I broke in, I was like, okay, but like I didn't really see any good reason to finish the degree because I'm not going to teach journalism. But I guess like I wonder at what point your politics began to change, because even when you started doing documentary filmmaking, you were still doing like leftist political kind of stuff,
very
right?
very leftist, very leftist. A lot of the documentary stuff I was doing was for the Intercept to put it in perspective, and then I also did stuff for like The Nation, places like that. I mean, sometimes it astounds me how recently it was that like I held these opinions. I think I was just thinking about it the other day about like some article I'd written or some video I'd done or something. And I was like, kind of like surprised that was just like a few years ago that I was like, still just like kind of bringing no real skepticism to the subject matter, I mean, it's really like, look, I was never woke or anything, but like, even then it was like, I find the work that I was doing, and I'm proud of some of the reporting that I did back then, but I do find it to be like a little bit like, in retrospect, a little like credulous and not brave, just like kind of reporting. I reported on immigration for a while, and I'm still very pro immigration, including pro illegal immigration. That sounds wrong. I'm not pro illegal immigration, but I'm very sympathetic to undocumented workers, and I'm totally fine with giving like hardworking people from other countries who are here illegally amnesty and stuff like that.
I mean, who would work in the kitchens in San Francisco? Am I right?
Exactly. I do want to fucking deport the fentanyl dealers from Honduras in San Francisco, and that puts me to the left of the immigrant rights movement. I mean, I'm sorry, to the right of the immigrant rights movement here, because they like literally here in the Bay Area, like to be pro immigrant rights is to be like, we shouldn't deport people who are like selling fentanyl and who carry machetes in their backpacks, so that if someone doesn't pay up, they can threaten to murder them. Like we shouldn't deport those people. But anyway, for normal law-abiding immigrants, very pro-immigrant. But like so I am proud of a lot of that. I'm still proud of a lot of that reporting I did. But I never like really asked myself tough questions. My job was to like go and get go and talk to the activist groups who would give me kind of the stories about how awful things were for undocumented immigrants and how afraid they were of law enforcement, and then go interview people they pointed me to for the most part, and then get some flavor and like some color and put together a compelling story that essentially argued the activist organization's line, and then they'd be very happy about that, and then they give me more stories, and it was like, it's access journalism just for activists. This is like, we make fun of people in DC, political reporters, who just do these puff pieces about politicians and call it access journalism, but like, that's what a lot of left-wing journalists do. It's just not with politicians, it's with like lefty activists. So I did that kind of journalism, which is what most journalism is. And that was not that long ago. I mean, it was really like, I think 2020 when things started shifting for me, which is the same for, I think, a lot of people. It was that year.
Yeah, absolutely. Was there a thing, or was it a bunch of things?
The major things for me were the lab leak. Yeah, the major things for me that made me start seeing suspecting that there was a matrix was the lab leak, and the way in which that was just transparently dismissed as part of a propaganda project, as racist, blah blah blah. I was like, wait, the lab leak thing makes sense, and just seeing the way in which it was relegated. And this is like the insane summer of 2020. I mean, it's like, somebody was telling me an anecdote about 2020 the other day, and I was like, it was hard for me to even believe it. And it was just a few years ago. It was just, things were so crazy. And then the other thing was the fucking, that physician's letter. Do you remember that at the height of the Black Lives Matter protests, there were like a bunch of physicians who signed a letter saying that structural racism is an even more acute pandemic than COVID-19. And so even though the right-wing chuds who were doing the anti-lockdown protests in Michigan were like absolutely horrible, deplorable people who probably should be thrown in jail,
all, and they don't care about killing people.
They just killing babies.
On each other.
Yeah, like all, and then but like the Black Lives Matter protests, it was like, I mean, they did do the throwaway thing, being like, you should stay social distance and wear your masks, but give me a break. And they were like, that is like, not only is that acceptable from our position as public health officials and epidemiologists and whatnot, but like, you need to do it. It's your obligation to public health. And it was such a naked propagandization of science, quote unquote, that was another big moment for me, that I was like, wait a minute, things are not as they seem.
Yeah, I definitely remember that hypocrisy around the Black Lives Matter rallies and protests, in the midst of telling everyone to not have funerals for their family members or hug one another, let their grandparents die alone in a hospital. And so what happened at that point with the Intercept and with the work that you were doing?
Actually, that's interesting. So I forget what year Charlottesville was, but it was pre-pandemic. But at that point, I was so this kind of backs it up to a negative experience. And this wasn't like a red pill moment. It was just sort of a negative experience with the Intercept. But I'd done this video, but it was like kind of the writing on the wall. I'd done this video and I spent a lot of time on it. And it was about the rise of the alt-right and the online origins of the alt-right. And it was very left-wing in its orientation. And I thought it was very good. And I sent the rough cut to the video editor there. She, I recollect, was happy with it, but then she sent it to this editor who was actually now the editor-in-chief there, but at the time was not. And he was actually my editor for a lot of my print stuff. And he was like, basically like, no, we're not gonna publish this. Like immediately, he was like, we're not gonna publish this. And I was like, I'd worked months on this thing. Like it was like and I was like, what's the fucking problem? And it was basically that it like didn't make the case. I think I was making the case that I was making the kind of Angela Nagel case that like the stuff came out of this troll culture, and it was like a sociological kind of analysis of the rise of the alt-right. And I think he just basically wanted to say like this is just the centuries long history of white supremacy in America, and that's what it comes out of. Just this really kind of basic, boring, and inaccurate storyline. Like the alt right, obviously you can compare the alt right to the KKK, like these literal white nationalists. But the origin was not linear from the KKK to the alt right. The origin was different, and it really was in like 4chan and all these places, like Angela Nagel has documented. So it was like, and then like, so then anyway, I don't want to bore you with the story, but I called in the big guns, which is Glenn Greenwald, and he just wrote this excoriating email to like the editors of the Intercept, being like, this is you guys are betraying like the founding principle of the Intercept by demanding these things.
Was he still with the Intercept at that point?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
But obviously he had like rubbed, there was obviously a lot of tension already there, and he just, he's like, Glenn's got like binary settings, right? Like on off. He's when he's on, it's just like full on, and he just like and it created this kind of crisis within and it was like little old me. I was just a freelancer. I'm not even staff of the Intercept. And they ended up saying, okay, they folded and said, okay, we'll run the video with these changes. And I had to do this stupid thing. It's fine, but I had to put like this image of the KKK and like some Getty image of some dude on a hood, and then like make reference to and I was like, this is like, does anybody not know this? I had to basically say, there was a period in which America was deeply racist. It was like so fucking, like, it was like so insulting to the viewer, that I even have to like point this out as if they don't know. But anyway, that was kind of the writing on the wall insofar as, a few years later, Glenn had another similar episode, except on his own behalf, around the Intercept trying to censor essentially his reporting on the Hunter Biden laptop. That's why he left the Intercept, is because he wrote a story on the Hunter Biden laptop, and they basically like wanted to like line edit it to make it like safer for their like polite liberal audiences. And he was like, fuck you, like you're not. And he just went went ballistic. He just like went scorched earth, and ended up like in a very public manner leaving the Intercept, the organization he founded. And of course, like several years later, the reporting around the Hunter Biden laptop, the stuff that the New York Post then later reported, all totally legit. It was a legit story. But the Intercept was afraid that he was going to, by reporting this, they weren't afraid that he was going to throw the election to Trump, and none of us wanted that. Like, I'm not a fucking Trump fan. I never, neither is Glenn. But that's not our role, right? We're journalists. We're not political activists. But they were not so much afraid that his story was going to throw the election to Trump. They were afraid, I believe, and this is what Glenn believes too, that they were afraid that they would be blamed by their peer groups for throwing the election to Trump if Trump won. And they'd gone through that experience before with Lee Fong, who's a good friend of mine, who's a reporter there, he was the guy on the rope line with Hillary Clinton who asked her the question that led to the line of attack on her Goldman Sachs speeches. Do you remember that?
Uh-huh.
Like, she was paid exorbitant amounts of money to speak to Goldman Sachs, and it became a campaign issue. He was the one who kind of, he asked her on the rope line this question about the Goldman Sachs speeches. He was the one who kind of discovered that. And then she gave this really just horrible reaction. She basically laughed in his face. And then that kind of went viral. So then that was 2016. And a lot of the top brass at the Intercept, this is kind of Glenn's theory, and I think it's credible, took a lot of shit from their, good liberal Brooklyn like peer groups saying, you guys contributed to this catastrophic outcome. And so in 2020,
and now a Nazi's in charge.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. And so in 2020, they were going to make goddamn sure that they couldn't take any blame, no matter, if Trump won. So they that was, I think, shaping a lot of their editorial decisions. That's Glenn's theory. I believe it.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. I'm glad
Yeah.
that you explained all that. I think that's an interesting background.
Exactly.
And how did you? So now, of course, you're working with Michael Schelenberger, at Public. You guys are doing all sorts of really cool, amazing, important work. How did that relationship begin? How did you two start working together? And then he of course brought you into the Twitter files. So I'd love to hear that how that all
Yeah.
went down also.
I want to preface this though by saying that you and I were talking the other day about drinking while doing an interview and how, like, when you first start to slur your speech, you should duck out. So you're going to give me a heads up, right? Because I'm drinking some wine right now. Because you'll know
You're
before
not.
I do that you're like, okay, you got to.
You're starting to slow down a little bit.
You start to sound
You
like an
already
idiot.
said that.
You think you sound really smart.
That wasn't funny.
So me and Michael actually met through Lee Fong, who I was just talking about, who I was going to bring out to hang out with us that evening when we were hanging out, when you and me and Michael were in San Francisco, but he couldn't make it.
Another time.
Yeah, another next time. So I think. So, I don't even know if I've told Michael this before. I think maybe I have, but like, I didn't know much about Michael. I just knew that he was this big nuclear booster, and I think I assumed, just like many other people do, and I'm embarrassed to admit this now, that he was like just a shill for the nuclear industry. Like, I was like, he wrote about it so much. I was like, this guy.
Like, who are you
There's
working
something
for
fishy about this
anyway?
guy. Yeah, totally. I was like, this guy. I remember in the Signal group that I'm in with a bunch of people, including Lee. I think it came up before, and I was like, they're like, what do you guys think of Michael Schellenberger? And I was like, no, that guy's fucking hack. Not knowing anything about him.
Hack.
Now he's like a good friend and journalist partner. So if Michael listens to this, sorry, my apologies. But I listened to him on Rogan. And I was like, and it was when he was talking about San Francisco. So I suppose I listened to, probably because somebody said it was really good, but also because obviously I'm interested in the subject, since I live in the Bay Area and grew up here. And I was like, oh, I got this guy all wrong. Like, this is like, first of all, he's fucking whip smart, knows what he's talking about, and I was like, he's right about this stuff, and I'm learning a ton about, like, it was like, not only was I like, oh, he's right, but also it was the first time I was hearing these ideas about what was causing these pervasive problems of homelessness and addiction in San Francisco. And so at that point I was like, Lee, can you connect me to him? And he was like, yeah, let's all go out to dinner. So we did, and we hit it off right away. And we went out, I think like the next week, maybe even a few days later, we were like, let's go do some reporting together. And we went and we did a story that exposed that San Francisco was running an illegal supervised drug consumption site at its new quote unquote linkage center, which was supposed to just be a center that linked homeless people to social services, but actually they had a supervised drug consumption site, which was like, that's actually generous calling it a supervised drug consumption site. It was just a courtyard where you were allowed to do whatever drugs you wanted to, and with people standing by with Narcan. It wasn't like in New York where they have these like little booths and it's like medical supplies and gloves and everything's hygienic. It wasn't like that at all. It was just like an extension of the Tenderloin behind a fence with people with Narcan just in case you OD. So we exposed that, like, I think probably within a week after we met.
Interesting. And how did he bring you into the Twitter files? And I'm curious to know what your expectations were going into the Twitter files. Like what did you expect to find, if anything?
So he'd been talking about the Twitter files, or he'd been talking about wanting to get access to this stuff before we were brought in. But, Elon Musk went to Barry Weiss and met Taibbi first, and then Barry brought in Michael. Michael brought me in. And I don't know that I had any real expectations. it was super exciting. But I can't recall having. I just thought it was I didn't know what we were gonna get, but what was unearthed was very gratifying.
Yeah, it was amazing. I don't want to downplay anything, but was it also like very amusing at all? Like, was it entertaining to be like reading through, like, I suppose like in a secondhand embarrassment kind of way, to be reading through all these Slack messages and emails that were just like, I don't even know how to describe it. I mean, they're just, those people just seemed so entitled around everything that they were doing, and no shame.
I mean, it was boring, first of all, because it's like, most of it is corporate messages. And like for every 900, for every one email you get, which is significant, you've read like 900 that are just like absolute, just corporate bullshit, just like the kinds of, we were looking at their Slacks too. So like their Slack messages and their emails. I think it was like, so some of it depends, like you start to form an impression about these individuals there. And so it's you stop regarding it as any kind of monolith, because you're like, these kind of characters keep popping up. And like some of them, yeah, I did find kind of repellent, and like, or at least just like hard to respect. Mm-hmm. And those were normally like, most of those were like high ranking executives, like Vijay Gaddy, who was like, came out of the intelligence, and then she was like, high up at Twitter. And then other ones were, and then there were other people who were, oh right, she kicked she kick you off?
I think she kicked me off, but she also went on Rogan and said that I was like harassing trans people, and that's why I got banned, and that I'd been warned many times.
It's like, Jesus, man. She's spreading misinformation. It's like all these people who talk about disinformation are just flagrantly spreading
lying.
It. Yes. Jesus Christ. So yeah, she sucks. And then like, and then there were like, and a lot of them were just like, whatever. They're just like doing their jobs, and they're just these corporate people, and they have, their Bay Area politics, and it's just what it is. And then there were like people, Yoel Roth, whose name comes up more than anybody else's. I found to be, and Michael agrees also, found to be a kind of interesting and complicated character. He actually, even though his name gets dragged out as this guy who we like totally beat up in the Twitter files, we didn't. If you look carefully what we reported, he often was the one who called bullshit on a lot of the accusations that certain tweets were like Russian disinformation. He was evidence-based, right? He'd be like, if there was no evidence that some tweeter or some tweet was actually Russian disinformation, he would say in the Slacks and in the emails, this is bullshit. He called out Hamilton 68 and was like, we should call this out on the bullshit it is. I think that was verbatim what he said. And so, he was he had integrity in terms of how he called the shots. But as Michael says, he was also a company man. So like when he would get overruled, like most importantly on the Hunter Biden laptop, he said, this is not a violation of any TOS. There's no indication that this is Russian disinfo. This is a legitimate news story. And then that was his determination as the head of trust and safety. Later on, the deputy chief counsel, Jim Baker, who was the former chief counsel for the FBI, kept insisting, no, this is Russian disinformation. And then a day later, Yoel Roth signs off on censoring it because he's a company man, right? Mm-hmm. So he both has integrity and is also, he's going to say when it's his jurisdiction, he's going to say, call balls and strikes exactly as they are. But if he gets overruled by a superior, he's not going to be the guy who fights back. So, all these people kind of took on different casts.
Did you get the sense that any of them kind of had any conscience around what they were doing? Like, do you think any of them thought that they were doing anything wrong? Or, do you think that they think or thought and still think that like they were just totally righteous in what they were doing?
Rarely, but from time to time. So like there's like on the side of like not having a conscience or not being oblivious to what you're doing, there was like a exchange between Vijaya Gadde and Ro Khanna, the congressman, in which he was basically saying, I believe it might have been around the Trump removal. One of the big things that they did that got a lot of media attention. He was bringing up concerns around the First Amendment, and he was bringing up, like in this email, he's bringing up U.S. case law around the First Amendment to Vijaya Gadde, and her response was, "But this isn't a violation of our terms of service." And it was like this total like he's talking about the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, case law around free speech, and she's talking about Twitter's terms of service. So it's like she just like didn't have the consciousness, like was just totally a kind of a robot for the company. And that pervaded the culture of Twitter then, I think, from the communications I saw. But there were actually a couple, like there was one Slack conversation in particular where like a low level or mid level employee was like going on a tirade about how fucked up what they were doing was, and about how destructive this was going to be, the potential risk to democratic governance, and was very articulate and very passionate about it, and got overruled, got ignored. People were like, yeah, I see your point, but we're clearly kind of just trying to like box him in and kind of gently push him away. But there were clearly, some folks in there who did understand the gravity of what they were doing, but not many, like maybe a couple.
Yeah. So you're from the Bay Area. You've lived in San Francisco or the surrounding area for quite a long time. What have you seen change?
I mean, the Bay Area sucks now. It's no other way to say it. I've lived in California a long time. I lived in LA for a long time too. So I've lived in both Southern and Northern California, but I grew up here and in Northern California in the Bay Area. And I mean, the funny thing is, like, I grew up in the 90s when crime was at an all-time high nationally, and the Bay Area was certainly no exception. So a lot of this feels bad, but also kind of familiar. Like back when I was growing up, the Bay Area had an edge, even though back then it was like, 20 years closer to the 60s. So it was like back then, there's that fucking Kurt Vonnegut quote which is probably apocryphal, that I got so sick of hearing because it was just brought up so many times about how like some purported graduation speech where he's like, everybody should live in New York for a couple of years, but leave before you get too hard, and then live in San Francisco for a couple of years, but leave before you become too soft. Ha ha ha. And that was kind of like, it was seen as a soft place, right, where everybody's nice, but it wasn't like that even then. There was like a hard, like some of the stuff now. So like I lived on the East Coast for a couple of years as well, and the I find the East Coast to be a much more generally functioning society than a lot of what I experienced on the West Coast, even though it's supposed to be the other way around, that everybody's so abrasive and rude and inconsiderate on the East Coast, and people are so friendly and nice on the West Coast. I find people to be much more considerate and friendly on the East Coast. I think a lot of it because you spend more time in public with other people in public. There's just more, like New York in particular, obviously. Boston to a certain extent too, but maybe DC. But like New York is obviously a place where you spend a lot of time in public. So you learn to tolerate other people. Just you have to. It's part of living in public. Whereas the West Coast is just so atomized, and everybody's in their cars and stuff, that people might be superficially nicer to each other, but like there's like some, I don't want to overstate it, but like I feel like if you have a psychotic personality, it's a culture in which those edges are not going to be sanded off. Like you're like, you can. It's also now I don't want to ramble, but like these trajectories are taking me to other places. But like, there's also this kind of progressive libertarian culture on the West Coast, which from because it pervades BC as well, with this sort of like it's almost came from the back to the land stuff, or maybe even it came earlier than that. But this very like,
I mean, we came out of Vancouver was like a hippie city, which is similar to San Francisco, as I understand it.
Totally. And San Francisco, like it goes like if you think about like the 49ers, like the miners who came out in 1849, it was very like these roughnecks coming from like the South and these rural areas, and they were just like, "Fuck you, I'm getting mine. Leave me alone." And it's kind of this Scotch Irish kind of like individual liberty kind of thing was very strong, and then it got fused. Well, I wrote actually an essay on this for Tableau once. It got fused with this kind of Puritan culture that came in, which was very top down. I won't bore you with all the details of what I wrote in this piece, but like it kind of fused this progressive tradition with this libertarian tradition. And in my opinion, you have kind of the worst of both worlds in the Bay Area, where which makes for a lot of really kooky politics. But I find it to be an environment in which, like, again, back in the 90s, like, there was like the kind of violence that would take place in the Bay Area compared to, I think, to place on the East Coast. There was more, you were more likely to be subject to like random violence from like some psychotic sadist who just fucks with you for no reason at all, like Joker kind of stuff. Whereas like in New York, for example, you were probably safe unless you were in the wrong place in the wrong time and were like caught in the crossfire, some gang thing, or like, but it was like, and again, of course, there's many anecdotal examples to cut the other way, but that's my general impression. And I think that that's coming back in the Bay now. There's just like a lot of this like weird, almost psychotic crime. It's like a lot of this like it's like random, chaotic, kind of like anarchistic, crazy crime, and it's an edge that is not a good edge in any way, shape, or form. So I think the Bay Area sucks. And I think it's grossly misgoverned. San Francisco is falling apart, not because it doesn't have the excuse that New York had in the 70s when it went bankrupt. San Francisco has tons of money. But it's chaos because it's misgoverned. And for that reason alone.
And it seems like a lot of that, like a lot of the really bad problems that are happening in San Francisco are due to both the fact that the cops don't really seem to do their jobs, but also there's like severe short staffing. Is that accurate?
Yeah, nobody wants to work for the SFPD because why would you? It's in like you get no backing from the city. You have politicians who blame you for everything. And there's like, I wrote a piece about this actually for the Free Press, where there's this exodus of cops from cities all over the country, San Francisco included, because of this anti-police kind of culture this wave that came out of 2020. But meanwhile, in the suburbs and more affluent, lower crime areas, they're having a field day. Like, just they're getting all these cops like for cheap. They're just hiring away all these cops from big cities in areas that do not need them. So I profiled a friend of mine who's now a cop in this very wealthy suburb where he's like got nothing to do, and he's a great cop who came out of Richmond, California, which is a really high crime area. And he's a specialist in mental health crises. So like he's exactly the cop that even the reformers say they're like, we should, like, cops shouldn't respond to mental health crises because they're not trained enough for that. He's like better trained than most social workers on how to deal. That's specifically what he does. And great cop. I know him because he was in my PhD program at Berkeley, but he completed it. He's a cop with a PhD, and he left because there was like no support for cops there. And he went to this area that's super white, affluent area that does not need him. So all these like areas that don't need great cops are getting them, like they have like a bargain basement sale of hiring these great cops. And then meanwhile, in the places with like huge crime, you call 911 and they're there 2 hours later because they're grossly understaffed by cops. So this is like this call out of Black Lives Matter and defund the police and all that stuff has created way greater racial inequalities in America around public safety. It is more dangerous to be a Black person in a low-income Black neighborhood today than it was in 2019 because of the exodus of cops, because of this political movement.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, one of the things that you and Michael pointed out to me when we went down to the Tenderloin District and we're walking around was that there was no cops anywhere and so much illegal activity and so much dangerous stuff going on. And you're right. Like I didn't see a single cop down there.
And there's a precinct right there. We walked like a block from it. Bodecker Park, which is, I don't expect you to remember, we walked right past it. The precinct is on that block. And like, there was like, so Michael and I were out in the Tenderloin the week before last, I think. And we watched, I think we told you about this. We watched this homeless woman having a really scary, like emotional, like breakdown. Like it was like, you see that shit all the time, but like this one was like really scary. And so we stopped and we were like, what is happening? And the guy we were talking to the guy who was with her, what's going on? He was kind of at a loss. So we called 911 and we waited for 15 minutes. Nobody came. We were 4.5 blocks from a hospital. I looked it up later to see exactly how far we were from St. Francis Memorial Hospital. 4.5 blocks from a hospital and like 3 blocks from the police precinct. We waited for 15 minutes. Nobody came. I don't think anybody came at all. I think as soon as we told them what block we were on, they just were like, didn't even put it through.
Yeah. And you two had a similar experience when you discovered a 14-year-old girl being trafficked. And you tried to alert the cops to get somebody to come rescue her. And
that was what we found was that, so we came into the story later. So there were these PIs who we went out with, who work for this great group called Finding Kids. It's called Special Operations Finding Kids. It's a nonprofit, and what they do is they locate mostly girls, but also boys who have been sex trafficked, like specific individuals, and they extricate them. And they have these private investigators who are ex-cops mostly who go and track them down. So we went out with these cops. So we weren't actually there when this happened. They told us about it and we reported on it, but they had located this girl who was actually, she's 14 now, but she was 13 at the time, who was a runaway and who had been sex trafficked, we're told by an informant, by MS-13 members. And so they located her. They'd been trying to locate her for ages. They found her. They knew what building she was in. They were outside the building. And they called the cops, but they didn't call 911, which is the only reason I bring this up is because the assistant chief of SFPD, when we talked to him, was like, they should have called 911, which I find to be kind of like an excuse because, like, give me a break. They knew they were former SFPD, so they knew cops there. So they called the contacts that they had at SFPD at the local precinct, and they were told, we're too busy to go out and extricate a 13-year-old girl who was being sex trafficked out of this building, who they'd put eyes on her. They knew exactly where she was. And then this one of the PIs, this guy named Paul Lozada, who, by the way, was the character reference for the swagger that Denzel Washington used in Training Day. He was like the character who he played. He was modeled after the swagger of this guy, Paul Lozada. He was like a consultant on the film. But anyway, he went to the precinct. He like drove down the precinct and went inside. And there were, like, of course, a bunch of cops just sitting around, just yakking. I don't know if they were literally playing cards, but that's what I recollect. But like just doing bullshit. There were like 8 cops around doing nothing, and so we reported on that, which is of course embarrassing to SFPD. And we went out and we found her again. This time we were with them. Turned around, found her were outside, put eyes on her, and then that time we like lined up calls. We'd already talked to the assistant chief at that point. So they had a direct line to him at that point. And of course, like that, then it was like 12 squad cars, like sirens blaring, just, convened on the thing, big show, got her out of there, shipped her out to Modesto or something, and put her in like a facility there. Unfortunately, since then she has run away from that facility, and maybe back into the life. Although then I think then I believe she's back with her grandmother now. But that was not what would have normally happened with SFPD. They did it because of the negative press.
Right.
But they are understaffed. They're 540 officers understaffed. So I don't want to fully blame it on them. They are grossly understaffed, and that's true, and nobody wants to work there, and that is a real structural problem to their being able to do their jobs.
I mean, what could turn this all around? Of course, it's a big question, but you're like, the Bay Area sucks now. Is there anything that could make the Bay Area not suck anymore? Like, what would have to happen in San Francisco?
I mean, in terms of the drug scene, I'm somewhat, maybe not optimistic, but I hold an open mind to the possibility that things could change, because I think residents there are just so fed up with it that, like, I think that there's going to be a sea change in terms of the political representation. To give you an idea of how fucked up it is for cops there's like, I reported this story too, for the New York Post. There was a cop, this guy named Daniel Solorzano, who was an SFPD, and he was going out and doing his job, and he was arresting drug dealers in the Tenderloin, as like a plainclothes officer, and he himself is Latino, as his last name would suggest. He's Mexican and Nicaraguan. His first language is Spanish, and and all of the dealers, the full-time dealers, the actual professional dealers in San Francisco are Honduran. And I mean Honduran nationals, not ethnics, like Honduran nationals. They're from Honduras. They're brought in by the Sinaloa cartel. I don't know why they choose Honduras. Sinaloa cartel obviously is Mexican. They bring in all these Honduras to be their foot soldiers, and so when he was arresting all these dealers, they were all Honduran, and there were a few people who he arrested who were not Honduran, who were like black and white, whatever. But those people he let go. And probably, I'm guessing, the reason he let them go is because they were probably not professional dealers, but rather addicts who the dealers often plant their stash on. They like pay them with drugs or cash to plant their stash on them. When cops arrest them, they're like, not interested in you, which is what they should not be interested in arresting just drug addicts, right? We all agree that they shouldn't be busting drug addicts. They should be busting professional dealers. But because of that racial disparity, the public defender accused the SFPD of racial discrimination against Latinos on the part of a cop who is half Nicaraguan and half Mexican, whose first language is Spanish, because all of the fucking dealers are Honduran. And then they tried to launch like proceedings against him that could have cost him his job, and they made an example out of this cop. So like, that's the climate in San Francisco. And by the way, like at the time, it was like with the full backing of the DA, because the DA at the time was Chesa Boudin. And so that's what happens if you're a good cop trying to do your job. So yeah, nobody fucking does their job as SFPD. So like, that can change when the politicians change. And the politicians will change. This is whatever, like Schoolhouse Rock version of the civic politics. The politicians will change when the voters change, and the voters are changing. Like, people are. There was a poll when the new DA was elected, Brooke Jenkins. She famously said that she was willing to charge dealers who sold fentanyl, whose sales could be directly connected to a fatal OD. She was open to charging them with murder. She made that announcement. She got a lot of shit for it from people on the hard left. There was a poll by the SF Standard that showed like something like 68% of voters in San Francisco were behind her on that. And San Francisco is the most liberal voting bloc in the country. So like, even in liberal ass San Francisco, people are like, yeah, throw those fucking dealers in prison. And so like, but yet the politicians are like, they're victims of human trafficking, which is bullshit. It's a lie. They know it's a lie. And and we should like blah blah blah. They're victims of society. Da, 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 da. The politicians are out of step with even San Francisco voters at this point, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, I've not lived in Vancouver for 2 years, so I'm less familiar with what's going on there than I was before. And certainly most of my friends back in Vancouver are still very progressive. But as I think I mentioned to you last week, Vancouver did surprisingly elect a less left mayor than they have in the past, who ran on a platform of hiring more cops. And he just went down and actually cleaned up the 10 cities down on the downtown east side that were just expanding and expanding and expanding, and that were, had full control over the area. No one was interfering. Yeah. So that does say something about people getting sick of the situation and wanting change and wanting more cops down there and wanting something to be done about the situation on the downtown east side.
Yeah, and in LA, where Karen Bass was elected, who was the progressive in the race between her and Rick Caruso, but she was, and I said this at the time, I like Karen Bass a lot, and she's considered this big lefty, but I was like, Karen Bass, I kind of know her background, and she makes nice with the kind of the white liberal, super lefty NGO activist establishment, but that's not her roots. Her roots are in the Black civil rights groups and the Black churches. And those folks are progressive, of course, but they're not like white liberal progressive. They're like, clean up our streets. Why the fuck are you allowing homeless encampments on our neighborhood? Get the drug dealers out of here. Like, people forget that, like, the Rockefeller laws, which are some of the strictest drug laws in the United States, were like the guy who in the crack powder cocaine disparity, which was famously this huge racial disparity. That stuff was like, Charles Rangel was the guy, Congressman Charles Rangel in Harlem was the guy who was demanding the Rockefeller laws, and I believe at one point he was like calling for execution of drug dealers. The crack cocaine penalties rose to the level they did because people in the Black communities that were where people were like, where moms were having to like hide in their bathtubs to not get shot in drive-by shootings from between drug gangs, were calling for harsher and harsher penalties on drug dealers. So like, that stuff is like, so that said, obviously, like, the Black churches are very progressive, but on some issues are very realistic and not at all in line with the white NGO world. And Karen Bass comes out of that background, I believe, and she's been making far more of an impact than any other political leader. At least I'm going to be tentative about this. I could end up eating like crow for this, but I believe that she's at this point making more of a difference in LA in terms of solving the homelessness problem than any other mayor up and down the West Coast, including Canada. So I think that there is some reason for optimism.
Okay. And what are you and Michael working on now and next? What's happening?
A lot of stuff on the censorship industrial complex. A lot of stuff we hope to do much more on sex trafficking, hopefully with your help. We want to do more reporting on that because it's just such a dire issue. And we've been, as you know, doing some reporting on the trans stuff. And by the way, just today, the Assembly in California passed a bill which basically allows like the state to kidnap kids. I'm like, it's almost not exaggerating. It allows kids to go seek medical treatment and psychiatric treatment without their parents' permission, which includes residential psychiatric treatment. So they can, without their parents' permission, they can go and be checked into a residential clinic, meaning basically a social worker can be like,
are we talking out of state? Like they're leaving the state to do this, or is this?
No, this is all in state. Actually, the out of state thing. I wish that they would still allow the out of state thing, because we were trying when we got that girl out of sex trafficking, we were like, she needs to be sent to an out of state facility because otherwise she's just going to run away and go back to San Francisco. But Gavin Newsom made that illegal because there was like one company that was doing this like out of state, that was like abusing kids who they're taking in. So then in some dumb, empty grand gesture, he was like, we're not allowing kids to leave California anymore. So I actually wish that rule was the reverse. But no, in this case, it's in state. But like, it's like basically like Chris Bray, who's a writer I admire on Substack, has a great piece about this, about like all these politicians who are like, I'm a mother, but I'm not qualified to give mental health treatment to my child. It's like they're like, I don't have a master's or a PsyD
Like
in
parents never
psychology.
have.
So how can I handle my kid having mental health problems? I need a specialist too. So I support this bill. It was like ridiculous. Anyway, so
need to hand them off to a professional to parent them.
Exactly. Hand it off to the state. It's crazy. I forget what the question was that you asked that got me.
Oh, I was asking what you guys were working on, and so you mentioned that you were focused a bit more on the trans stuff as well as the trafficking stuff.
Right.
So that's how that.
Yeah, and then of course the censorship industrial complex, which is probably our main focus.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I hope that, I definitely hope to do some work with you guys on the sex trafficking prostitution issue for sure.
Yes.
And I hope that you guys will be able to maybe make it out to Vancouver to check out the situation on the downtown east side. And
I want to make a point of it. I would like to see that with my own eyes.
Yeah, you got to. It was really awesome talking to you. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm so glad that we've connected, and I'm excited to stay in touch and hopefully work together in the future.
Awesome. Thanks, Megan.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.